we wanted to kick off with a video that you've just done, Jimmy,
Mm.
which is
Hmm.
on knife crime.
Yeah, fun one that.
And
A rabbit hole of a video because I read this really interesting paper. It was called "Policing the Crisis in the 20th Century." So effectively, there was this old paper called "Policing the Crisis," and it was like in the 70s. It was about mugging. So the
mm,
term mugging was this sort of just ethereal term that never had like a direct definition. And so the police didn't use it. Like they didn't have a recorded crime, which was mugging. The newspapers just started to report this new crime, this new phenomena, supposedly, which they called mugging. And it turned out like probably there wasn't a rise in this crime and probably it already been happening. But when they gave it that sexy title, or it was mugging, it like really got the boys going, and they were like, it was on the newspapers. And so Police in the Crisis, the paper I read, it's by, I think her name was Elaine Williams, and it was about it in the new era, like now, and like it was called it was knife crime youths. That was the term. It was like knife crime youths, and that was all over the newspapers. And it was only really popping up on the newspapers from like 2003 onward. Beforehand, people just didn't really like. They never really put their finger on what it was. Like it was just murder.
mm,
Like that, no one really. But the media and the newspapers started to keep saying knife crime youths, and it became like a moral panic. Originally, I wanted to go in more down the angle of like the race stuff and show how it was like really mischaracterizing, because I always see it where
mm.
people are like saying it's multiculturalism and all this sort of stuff. And so I wanted to go down that, but then when I found that, it made me question. I sort of made a joke in the video about Jordan Peterson. I was like, what even is knife crime? Because it didn't even seem like it truly was this new phenomenon, like proportionate to all murders that were happening ever. I've started to be able to use these videos to educate myself on these topics where I know I'm probably victim to like reading misinformation and just taking that in as like a core belief. And
Mm.
then when you find the evidence that sort of breaks that, yeah, it breaks it, it's really helpful. And yeah, a lot of looking into the sort of Glasgow stuff about how Glasgow managed to become have less knife crime
Yeah, yeah.
as multiculturalism increased there. One of the things I touched on in the video was like how the bit about gentrification. So it was like a lot of the stuff that's probably we're seeing more now was probably always happening, but
Mm.
there was so much more like in a way segregation. So gentrification was an interesting part of it because now you're seeing white people, white middle class people moving into what were previously poor, rough neighborhoods. And so now you're seeing like potentially they're going to be a victim to an attack, and then that becomes newsworthy, and then that's all over the news. And whereas those attacks might have been happening all the time, but we just never saw it because it didn't really affect our bubble. And then you got to think like, and this is one I want to look more into, but it's like social housing, even like say the 60s, where
Mm.
compared to now, like murder was lower. Um, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I read something about how with social housing, I think there was a lot of racial discrimination. So probably white neighborhoods were kind of just kept white neighborhoods, and then sort of like different, like black and ethnic minorities, etc. They were put into different neighborhoods, and they would obviously be poorer. So that's gonna sort of that's the breeding ground for crime is the poverty and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So we're just not seeing it. And then what happened is when we start seeing it more, then it becomes important to us because it affects our lives. And now we talk about it a lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this stuff was always kind of happening, but it was all sort of in the sort of fog of non middle class culture. And we just weren't really paying that much attention to it. It's hard to know, but I think there is a lot of that potentially.